what we launched, how we launched, and why. It seems like it wasn't very clear, and I don't think we've discussed it in very much detail with the community. But there is a specific reason to what we did and how we did it. And I just wanted to share and make sure everyone is on the same page and maybe ask some questions if some clarification is necessary. So I guess we can start with what is Subspace. And Subspace is a blockchain. And as any other blockchain, it needs some kind of consensus mechanism such that nodes can agree on what the history of the blockchain is. To share and there are different categories or like families of blockchains. There is proof of work and proof of stake, which most people are familiar with. We are in Subspace in the category of proof of capacity. Broadly speaking, that means that the disk space is used for achieving consensus, but there are different ways to do that. One of them is proof of space. That basically means proof of useless space in our case, if you're talking about Chia. So they're just wasting space with some random data, just like Bitcoin uses electricity and compute to achieve consensus. Subspace is more specifically from proof of replication family, where some data is replicated and the proof that the data is replicated is used to achieve consensus. And Subspace is using even more specific version of that, which we are calling proof of archival storage, which means we are not storing just random data, or some kind of user data. We are storing the blockchain itself, which is a distinctive feature of Subspace. So the data that farmers are plotting, that is the blockchain. The way they do it is very special, and they are actually not storing the original blockchain data. They are storing data after erasure coding, which means that we are taking the blockchain itself and we basically make it twice as big for redundancy purposes. And then that data that is twice as big is actually what's written to disk. And some people in the community were asking, why is it so much more demanding on the disk side of things comparing to the stress test? The reason for that is, again, coming from the consensus. Since we are storing the blockchain itself, then the question is how big the blockchain is. And in stress test, the blockchain was very small because there wasn't really any data stored on the blockchain. Farmers just were producing blocks, and those blocks were empty, and that was about it. So however many blocks we've produced, empty blocks, that was the size of the blockchain. So let's say if the history of the blockchain is 5 gigabytes, and we are ratio coding that to make it twice as big, then every farmer would store a node, which is 5 gigabyte, and they will store data for farmer, which is 10 gigabytes because it's twice as large. So 15 gigabytes per node, that's not really a lot, and that was sufficient to run a stress test, basically. However, there is one parameter in the protocol that basically makes every plot of the farmer internally split into subplots. And those subplots are of the size of 100 gigabytes. And when we are going into the Gemini, we really want people to dedicate as much space as they want. So like in the stress test, everyone was storing the same amount of data, that 10 gigabytes I mentioned. On the Gemini, we want to allow everyone to use as much space as they want or as little as they want. And that means that we need to store multiple replicas of the blockchain, but also because of that 100 gigabytes subplots that we have in the farmer, we really want to fill them up completely. So if you have, let's say, 1 terabyte and you have 10 subplots and all of them are 100 gigabytes, you really want to use all of that space available and not just 5 gigabytes of each 100, which would mean that you are wasting 95% of your space and not getting rewards for that. So in order to do that, according to our consensus, our blockchain needs to be 50 gigabytes because 50 gigabytes times 2 will be 100. You will be able to fill all of those subplots on your disk. And that is why the sync process takes longer and the disk requirements are higher, is because the blockchain itself is bigger. And since our blockchain allows to store useful data, it's not just random data that we generated. Actually, if you are going into the history of the blockchain, and let me just quickly check the block number. The block number 4, if you go to the history of the Gemini, if you go to the Explorer and type number 4 in the block number, you will see that there is a transaction there. And that transaction puts data onto the blockchain. And that data is actually a zip archive of the source code of our stress test network. And after that, in the blockchain history, again, you can go through the blocks. You can find that there are actually 2 feeds created, feed number 0 and number 1. And feed number 0 actually stores all of the blocks from our stress test. So what that means is that our Gemini network actually stores on-chain our source code and the history of the stress test. So you can download the source code from the Gemini network, build it, and then sync the blockchain again from Gemini as it was as of stress test. So you can find all of those early participants on the network. You can see how many blocks they farmed and so on. All of that is stored permanently on Gemini. And that is taking part of the history. And then the feed 1 is a partial history of the Polkadot blockchain, just so you can fill the space to get to that 50 gigabyte mark. So that is why we basically have a bigger blockchain. That's why the blocks are ticking slower, because every block is not like 4 kilobytes. It's actually like 3 megabytes, which is really unusual for blockchains. Very few blockchains are actually designed to store large amount of data. But that's what Subspace can do. And the initial Gemini 1 has launched in a way where we had basically a very few nodes that were synced fully. So they had the full history. So we are like Subspace Labs as creators of the blockchain. We've actually used the sudo key for the network, like admin key, and we've uploaded that data so you can actually verify that the author of those transactions is not some random person on the internet. It's actually the same person or like the same account that is hard-coded in the source code itself. So it's kind of, you can kind of trust to a degree the authorship of those transactions. And we basically opened that network with a few nodes for everyone else to sync. But due to the combination of different factors, including the way of doing things in the subspace, like the data storage and the permissionless nature, and the way things are implemented in Substrate, which is the blockchain framework we are using, and some of the other implementation challenges, like all of those aspects combined basically caused nodes to fork into different directions. It was really hard for them to actually download those blocks. So some of the nodes were just creating alternative histories of the blockchain that are much lighter, kind of like on the stress test, and they basically diverged from each other, and that caused basically network to break, roughly speaking. That was the end of Gemini 1A, as we call it. And we've launched Gemini 1B a few days later, where we have fixed a few things, but not all of them. And we were fixing with the software upgrades down the road. And I hope everyone will upgrade soon. It's still not everyone that is upgraded. There are still many nodes that are using the old software. But we basically increased number of archival nodes. We've changed a little bit the rules in the consensus such that nodes that are not fully synced are not trying to produce those blocks in alternative forks. But there were still some edge cases that caused some of the network participants to diverge from the like what we call canonical chain. That's what you can observe in the Explorer, and that is the block height you can observe in the Explorer. But if you go to the telemetry, you can see many nodes are actually on much higher block number, and that's because they have a buggy version of the software. They can choose to not upgrade, but that's really that it really means that they are running for basically no reason. They'll not be able to join the the rest of the network. And I think we have a pretty good results so far. It seems like about a third of nodes on Gemini 1B, latest revision, are actually fully synced, which is really, we're really happy to see that. There are still some rough edges, but we are on a good trajectory. And there was actually another misstep that we had with the size of the node. We were expecting that will be just 10 gigabytes. Turns out everyone is actually running archival node, regardless of the parameters they specify, which means that once more nodes are fully synced, they are helping others to sync. So there will be a tipping point very soon that will make everyone sync way faster, and everyone should converge on the correct history, and will enable the rewards. Right now, rewards are disabled, so everyone is producing blocks, but no one is rewarded for that. Um, and from there on, I think Gemini 1B will only get better, and we'll have more iterations of the Gemini in the coming months, weeks and months. Yeah, I think this is the short gist of what has happened and why we had to upload that history and why it takes so much. And some were complaining that it uses a lot of disk space, but that's kind of the point, right? We are not trying to waste CPU or other resources. We are trying to use disk space. And the more disk space you use, the higher is the probability that you will win the block reward or vote reward, which is another thing we've added. There are votes which allow us to increase the reward frequency by about 10x. So you shouldn't wait for 3 days. It will be 10 times smaller than that, the interval. Um, and yeah, I think from here we can maybe try to answer some questions from the audience.
That's a great explanation, Azar. Thank you. And I just want to remind people who are joining us that we do have a chat for this office hours. So you can go into the office hours chat. It's in Discord right above the event stage if you don't want to raise your hand. If you would like to raise your hand and ask a question, please go ahead and do that. Nazar, one of the things that you mentioned was about disk space and the potential people be concerned about it being taken up. And I saw some other people posting about bandwidth concerns. Potentially, some people, were concerned because all the bandwidth it was taking up, that this was going to be an ongoing issue. And I believe that's not really the case. So, can you just talk a little bit? And you kind of addressed this already, but about the bandwidth and how that's a big impact initially, and maybe how that changes over time.
Sure. So since the history of the blockchain is not generated, it's like actual data stored, and the size of the blockchain is 50 gigabytes. That is basically the ideal bare minimum that you absolutely have to download, and there is no other way around it. And that takes time on like any internet connection. It's not non-negligible amount of time, and non-negligible amount of bandwidth spent during that time. However, due to that forking that I mentioned, there are actually alternative histories of the blockchain that every node is trying to sync, and then in most cases just rejects or like imports, but really does nothing with it. And that is also wasting a lot of bandwidth, unfortunately, just due to how the network works. And because it's permissionless network, it's not controlled by anyone really, um, in like a full sense of the word. There is no way for us to like disable those nodes. They're just running for however long they want, and all we can do is to update software. We can make announcements, but ultimately it's up to the users to update their software and stop producing those blocks. So what we see on the network is that like parasitic unnecessary bandwidth spent is actually going down, and we've done some of the tweaks to the software, and there's actually a new pre-release today, will be released very soon, that actually fixes some more of those edge cases, that basically tries to reject those blocks as soon as possible. But it's kind of inevitable at this point that some of that will still happen for a while. But eventually, it should go down, and shouldn't be a big problem. But just be mindful that right now and the like short-term future, the protocol will use some amount of bandwidth, and it should get better soon.
Nazar, I also know you've done a lot in the last couple of days. We've been throwing quite a bit of hardware at this just to try to help that initial production or that initial replication take place. So, what are some of the things that Subspace has done and things that we've maybe put in place to kind of help this process along just to get started?
Yeah, so since anyone who wants to join Gemini 1B has to download the history from somewhere, and there are many nodes on the network still that are either not fully synced, which means they are not like sharing the data yet, or they are on their own like history that you reject when you try to download it. So in both of those cases, it's like really not those nodes are really not helpful to you. We decided to increase the capacity that we have, the number of archival nodes that are serving the proper, full, correct history. And we've added over 25 gigabits per second of bandwidth globally to help people sync. And judging by telemetry, we have several thousands of people that have already fully synced. So those are actually helping the rest of the community to sync faster. So that's what we did on the hardware side, in addition to just software upgrades.
And I see we have a question in the chat from Big Jim asking if we've hit 3,000 sync nodes yet. And he would like to know where we can check this. And you already mentioned it's telemetry. And then part two of his question is what the colors mean. Some are white, some are gray, some are dark. If you go to the various records on the telemetry site, he's asking what those reference in particular.
Yeah, so the first number you need to look at is going to the Polka.js apps, opening Gemini 1 network, and see what the latest block number is in there. That is the actual block number you need to be aware of. And if you go to telemetry, you will see that there are a number of nodes that are actually higher than that, but you basically need to ignore that because uh, those nodes are like what community call them runaway nodes. They're just like producing blocks on their own at 1 block per second frequency. They're just doing their thing. You need to ignore them. If you scroll down a little bit, you will see a whole bunch of nodes that are on exactly the same block height, and that block height is actually either exactly the same that you've seen on the telemetry, or like a few blocks or a few tens of blocks apart from that. If the Explorer is a little bit lagging behind, and those are the nodes that are actually like up to date and you can sync from and so on. So you can see that the number of those nodes is quite significant. If you have some scripts, you can actually check how many exactly, but just visually you can just scroll through the page. You can see that there are 10,000 nodes there, and about a third of the page is used by those nodes, so that's like about 3,000, roughly speaking. And about the colors, I believe those colors, like we are using telemetry from the Polkadot ecosystem, so that's like generic one. We just changed colors to match the Subspace aesthetic. I believe those colors depend on the block height and difference. So the nodes that have the highest block number are actually white, and those that are further apart are darker. And because we have a few nodes that are very, very high because they're producing blocks at ridiculous rate, they're just white because of that. But don't worry about it too much. I think if you are syncing from Genesis and you're like at block 10, you will be darker than the rest, but it will change over time.
And Nirna ETH has asked in the chat also that it looks like that the farmer sometimes seems to stop or pause for a little bit and then try to catch up again. And if you could just explain why that's happening, that would be helpful.
Yeah, it depends on what you actually observe and how you interpret it. So generally, as the history of the blockchain gets bigger, that history needs to be plotted by farmers. So that's exactly when you will see some lines printed by the farmer that they've plotted something new to the disk. However, it doesn't have to print those lines all the time if history only gets bigger a little bit, because the plotting happens in like batches of 1 MB. And since the blocks are small, once you've synced, that only happens like every 100 blocks or something like that. So don't worry if it doesn't print anything. If it looks to be just stuck, it's not. It's farming in the background. And if it actually wins the block or a vote, it will print that it has signed something. That something is not a block hash. However, it does indicate that your farmer is working and trying to solve the puzzle set by consensus, and everything is fine.
It's a great explanation. Thank you. Again, for anybody who's just joining us, thanks for coming to the office hours. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'll go ahead and invite you to the stage. There's also a chat for the office hours that you can drop your questions in. Nazar, our CTO and co-founder, is here answering questions today about the testnet or anything else you'd like to ask about Subspace in general. So please, if you have any questions, go ahead and post them or raise your hand. And not seeing any at the moment, we will take some of the more common ones that we've seen in the chat, some of the things that we've seen in the forum and so forth, and maybe that will help some of the people that are here. Um, so, Nazar, somebody had asked previously about nodes, and did they start serving data to the network as soon as they are live, or only once they're synced to the target? When's that actually starting to occur?
That happens when the node thinks it is synced, which means that it is either actually synced or all of the nodes that it is connected to right now are no higher than the node itself. So, like, if you are connected to 50 other nodes and those 50 other nodes are not fully synced either, but you catch up with them, like your node will think it is ready and it will start sending data to others. So there are like basically two cases, and this is something that we'll be improving in Substrate upstream to make that mechanism more reliable. That's something that we've already had to tweak and something we had issues with, and this is one of the reasons why we had increased forking comparing to what we expected. So yeah, basically one case, it needs to think it is fully synced, but it's not necessarily mean it is fully synced.
Great response. And that leads into something else. Another message people have been seeing that they're asking about is the keep block issue. That continues to pop up on the screen. And there's been a few questions about exactly what that means, if you could explain in a little more detail.
Yes. So our node has a whole bunch of different parameters. Some of the parameters we specify in the official documentation. I don't really recommend you to mess with other parameters. Some people have tried, and that may lead to to your farmer not actually farming, or like setting up in a non-static configuration. Um, the keep blocks specifically is a parameter which is supposed to limit how many latest blocks you are storing or like your node is storing. So by default, we specify 1024 blocks. And that means that from the very newest block that your node is aware of, it should store 1024 blocks down into the history. However, turns out that that parameter is only removing older blocks if they are finalized, but our blockchain is permissionless. It doesn't have validator set like Polkadot has, for instance, and none of the blocks are actually finalized, so none of them are actually removed. This is something we'll probably fix in the next couple of updates, and the history of the blockchain is actually like, or the history that you are storing will actually get smaller. But that was something unexpected for us from the implementation side of things, and that is the reason why we thought it will take up to 10 gigabytes at the worst case, but it was taken 48 gigabytes right away, and it will grow over time. So that's why we've changed our requirements for the disk space, unfortunately.
So, since you had mentioned that currently all the nodes are archival nodes, and now because of the keep block, does this mean that rogue nodes are potentially serving rogue force to new nodes joining the network, or is that something that can't happen?
Actually, they do. That was another interesting discovery. Yes. The tweak there is that the way the start of the Gemini was implemented, it was implemented in such a way that the very first block author was considered to be like the root author, meaning that that block was created by the admin key from the blockchain, and then the first like n number of blocks, about like 33,000 blocks, where we were uploading the stress test and Polkadot. All of those blocks were only created by the initial block author. However, if the node was connected to just the nodes that are not synced at all, it will think it's online uh, genuinely, and it will think that it's fully up to date. So it will try to produce that first block and will try to build the history further. But once that node goes offline, there is no one else to continue that fork. So you'll see that there are some of the blocks or some of the nodes that are stuck at block height 190,653. That is the block height where the node that was building those blocks actually upgraded. And everyone else is just like stuck there because they're not allowed by the consensus rules to build blocks on top. So Those other forks that are still building at like block height 400,000, they will get into the same situation and they will die off eventually. But for the time being, we'll have to watch them.
There are some questions in the chat, and we're going to get to those in 1 second. But just to keep going on this, one of the other questions that we had taken from the chat that kind of feeds into what you were just saying, Nazar, is about the releases. There's been several new releases that have come out, and if somebody is downloading the most recent release, is that somehow preventing new nodes from downloading data from any of these rogue forks, from these other archival nodes that are sitting out there?
Yes, it fixes several problems. It will make those new nodes not try to build alternative histories in the first place. It will prevent them from importing some of the broken history as well. However, some of the bandwidth is still wasted because before you can decide whether that block is okay to import or not, you need to download it. And the way the sync process implemented in Substrate is it downloads blocks in batches of 64, and that 64 is quite big, it turns out. And that basically means that you will download 64 blocks and then you will throw them away once the very first block is actually not the block you want. So in that sense, it does fix some of the problems, but not all of them.
So then addressing one of the questions that is in the chat now, which I see Pascal has already answered, about stopping and starting the nodes without wiping or purging. Since we're talking about releases, we'll jump down to that one, and then I'll jump up to Pascal's question about the roadmap and let you come in on that too, Nizar. But first, yeah, how about just starting and stopping nodes when new releases are downloaded and so forth, how that process works, and if that's possible without wiping or purging?
It's actually possible and recommended in most cases. Sometimes when you happen to be on that fork that's like a runaway fork, then you need to start over. And we have documentation, like a paragraph in the official documentation that tells you what kind of logs the node will print if it identifies itself on that incorrect fork. So there are some like heuristics where we can identify that yes, this particular node is on there, and it will complain the logs. And if you see those messages in logs, you'll need to reset it. Otherwise, you can just continue, and most of the nodes were just able to upgrade and continue. There is no need to start over and download everything and cause additional load onto the network and just waste your time.
And you mentioned logs, Nazar. That's one thing I've seen people asking in the chat, and I think I saw your answer when it comes to logs. I think you said that the logs are on screen. That's what you see. That they should not be digging through files trying to find things. It's basically what's captured. Is that correct?
Yes, that depends though on how you run it. So general like modern cloud native way of running CLI applications is just to just print logs to the terminal. If you run it with systemd or Docker, those logs will actually be captured by those systems and they will be stored separated so you can look at them later. If you just run it in CLI directly, that's what you have. You can redirect it to file, but otherwise it's just on your screen. And if you're running a desktop application, logs are actually stored in the file, and that file can be located later. And if you install, I don't know if we have the release yet. If not, we will have today, 064. There will be a button that will basically lead you to the file explorer with the file, so you'll be able to find the file very easily. It wasn't very trivial to find the file before, unfortunately, but we are getting better. We are taking the feedback from the community into account.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes it a lot easier. Now, stepping back to Pascal's question, which is a little broader in nature, about the Subspace Gemini roadmap or timeline. And I don't think we've committed to anything specifically, but in terms of the Gemini roadmap, potential iterations of the incentivized testnet, maybe future versions of the testnet, and so forth, is there anything you can add to that for Pascal?
Yeah, there will be several iterations of Gemini. It will take probably several months to go through them. We are not ready to commit to particular dates. We have certain like versioning to them. So the first attempt was Gemini 1A. It failed. We started Gemini 1B. If you need to make breaking changes to the protocol, there will be 1C and 1D and so on. And once we have a next major milestone achieved on Gemini, there will be Gemini 2. This will be like a new big feature release. And every time we will do that kind of transition, there will be a need for everyone to restart, but we will have an announcement about that well in advance. So don't worry about that too much. Just make sure you don't mute our server and you can get those announcements in due time.
Yeah, definitely don't mute. We wouldn't want that. Um, Another question that came through, Nazar, is about potential iterations, something to decrease RAM usage on the client side. Is there anything being targeted in future releases to maybe help it consume less RAM?
Yeah, our target is to basically run nodes on machines with under 4 gigabytes of RAM. So something like Raspberry Pi with 4 gigabytes should be sufficient. And by the way, we have AR64 builds in the official releases now on the CLI side. They're not optimized, so if you build it from scratch yourself in production build, it will be consuming less RAM and CPU, but it is there nevertheless, both in Docker and CLI versions. Um, there is like I think one of the biggest reasons why there is a higher RAM usage is that part where the whole history is stored by every node. Where storing only last few blocks, it would have been much lighter. This is something we are looking for, and there are several tickets in the substrate upstream that we are also trying to resolve with folks from the Parity Technologies. So definitely expect improvements in the future. Right now, 8 gigabytes of RAM is recommended. It may crash from time to time and restart. That's not a big problem. Like as soon as you run it with Docker or something like that, and it restarts automatically, it should continue from where we stopped. But in the future, the RAM usage will definitely decrease significantly. It just takes time to optimize these kinds of things.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Wei, I see you're on the call, and one of the questions that just came in is about when we'll know more about the token supply, allocations, etc., for Subspace credits, and when people who participated in previous stress tests are going to receive the reward. Um, if you're standing by, I would love for you to step in and answer that one. I don't think so, Pascal. Hopefully that answers your question. So I guess for some more general statistics, Justin, you have typically given our updates and to talk about just kind of where we are. and the kinds of things that are going on in the community. So, would you like to come on and say a few words about that, Justin?
Yeah, of course. So we've been seeing some pretty great support on the Gemini testnet to start. Like others have mentioned, I greatly appreciate everyone with their understanding and patience through the issues. Definitely been a fun process, but we're getting through it, and it's been great to see the continuous support from the community and seeing the community support each other through various different issues that we've all been having. I'm trying to get this guy up and running. But with that being said, we're up to about 10,000 Gemini nodes, currently 10,297. It's climbing as I'm looking at it. So definitely I'm starting to see an increase. We haven't quite fully hit the numbers that we saw on the stress test, but I think that's expected to be expected, especially with some of the syncing issues, and also we're likely seeing less people doing multiple nodes and that kind of thing in this case. But overall, the network's been slowly chugging along, especially with the nonstop work of the development team improving these issues. I think we'll continue to see it grow.
That's great. One of the questions that was put in the chat as well is asking about the maximum recommended farm size. And I know that we hit a point of kind of equilibrium there that Nazar had talked about before, where syncing the chain versus plotting the disk, there's kind of like a tipping point there. So this kind of gets to that question. And then the second part was, if the farm is too big, it seems to place a heavy compute and I/O demand on the computer. After it takes place, the farmer starts, salt will be updated, and when this happens, the node often loses sync. What is happening? Nazar, you want to take that one?
Sure. So there is a trade-off that I think our community will, or like the ratio between the compute and the storage that our community will help us figure out in terms of how many CPU cores you need per terabyte. Generally, when your node is syncing, your farmer is also plotting, and that plotting process means that you are encoding the history in unique way for your particular farmer. And don't try to copy the farmer data from one machine to another. You'll get burned. Like your plot will get burned on the protocol level. Some people have already tried and they were burned. So try to plot properly to avoid that issue. And that requires CPU resources or even GPU resources if you are using CLI in the or even desktop, I believe. It was supporting CUDA, and the next release will also support NVIDIA and Intel GPUs. So that process will be accelerating as well in terms of CPU usage. However, you still need to encode it, and after that you need to write it. So if you have, let's say, 1 terabyte, that means that you have 10 of those subplots, and each of those need to be written. So by the time you sync 1 gigabyte of the history, you need to write 20 gigabytes to disk, right? And of course, that takes some I/O and it takes some CPU resources. So that is kind of unavoidable. But the good thing is that it only happens once where you sync the history, and after that, it's like ongoing negligible process. It only updates half of your plot every time the history of the blockchain doubles, which over time gets more and more rare event. And in terms of salt update, we'll need to see what exactly is happening there. But the salt update basically means that your farmer will go through all of through the whole plot, and it will create a new commitments database which is used for actual solutions. And that is usually not very CPU intensive process. It just takes time to read it from disk. I'm not entirely sure why in those particular cases something was like stopping or restarting or something. But we are following that on the forum, and we'll try to find solution for that as soon as we can.
That's great. And before I ask the follow-up question, Nazar, about the max plot size command, I just want to remind people, if you would like to ask a question, you can either put it in the office hours chat or raise your hand to request to speak. We've got Nazar, our Chief Technology Officer and co-founder, Wei Li, who you just heard before. who is our chief marketing officer, Justin, who is the community support manager that everyone is accustomed to dealing with on a daily basis. They're all here. They'd love to answer your questions. So if there's anything at all you would like to ask, please go ahead and put that in the chat or raise your hand. We'll bring you up to the stage. So part two, I guess, of that question that just came up, Nazar, was about using the max plot size command along with the farmer. So can you maybe talk a little bit about exactly what that is and how that works?
Yeah, that parameter, if you actually go to the help command and read what it does, it says only a developer testing flag. So basically, it's not intended for use. It's not helpful in any way, shape, or form. It's just for development purposes for us when we are testing the blockchain on a very, very small scale and we want to restrict that size. It doesn't help you to get any kind of benefit whatsoever. So try to not use that. It will only make things worse, not better.
Great answer. Thank you. And moving into another question about GPUs. When GPU has been a question that we've heard quite a few times. I know that in future releases, we are absolutely implementing some GPU optimizations to be able to plot faster. So maybe, Nazar, if you can talk about when that would be available and exactly what people can look for in terms of improvement. And then also, if we have any instructions about how that will be utilized.
Yeah, so TLDR is actually already supported. So on Linux and Windows, CLI actually already uses CUDA if it's available. The only trick is that it's not really very helpful right now. In that sense that the sync process of the node and sync process or like plotting process of the farmer, they are coupled. What we are working on right now, some of our engineers, is we are upgrading the sync process such that because farmers are actually storing the history of the blockchain, that means that some farmers can sync from other farmers instead of going through the node and all of the complex process. So in that sense, the sync process will become faster for farmers. The sync process will become faster for nodes. And since farmers will be able to download more data at once, there will be more sense to use GPUs because GPUs are optimized for processing big like batches of parallel work. And when you download a lot of pieces, you can just process them in parallel. But right now, even if you don't have NVIDIA GPU, like 4 cores should still be sufficient for like 1 terabyte plot. And if you have bigger plot, you hopefully have a little bit more CPU. But if you don't, it will just take a little bit longer for encodings. The current iteration supports CUDA. The next iteration will support CUDA through OpenCL layer. So you'll be able to use CUDA with NVIDIA GPUs. You'll be able to use AMD GPUs and even integrated or discrete Intel graphics. So basically, any kind of GPU you might have on the desktop side or laptop should be supported. And that will accelerate the plotting process greatly. But it is still a little bit work in progress.
Excellent, thank you. And Jeff Flowers, one of our esteemed ambassadors, is asking a follow-up question to what you asked before, what you were talking about before with the max plot size, Nazar. Is that something that might be available in the future? And then are there any special flags that will be needed to run it? And I assume he's talking still about the max plot size, although Jeff, your question came in when we were talking about GPUs, so it looks like you're clarifying. But Nazar, will that max plot size be available in the future? Maybe take that while he clarifies that question.
It will be available as a flag, just doesn't make any sense to specify. It's like an internal notion on the protocol level that doesn't make any sense to customize. Instead, there is a flag called plot size, just plot size. And that's where you specify how big your plot is. And that will restrict the size of the data that the farmer will store. So if you want to restrict farmer to only use, let's say, 5 gigabytes, just specify dash plot size 5G, and it will use just 5 gigabytes and not more. You don't need to specify max plot size for that.
Okay, and he now has clarified and said he was thinking of the GPU option in the CLI. So when people go to plot, will there be a flag that they would need to specify in order to take advantage of GPU plotting versus just traditional CPU plotting?
No, not really. It will try to recognize all of the GPUs it can use, and it will actually use all of them at the same time, if possible. if there is like enough work to be done. So there will be instructions of specific drivers if you need to install them on a particular system. For instance, on Linux, you need to install a special software from AMD to take advantage of the GPU. For Intel, it just works. So we'll have those instructions in time, but otherwise you don't need to do anything special. It will just recognize it automatically.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And Wei Li, hoping you're still available. We have another question about potentially future plans on upcoming grants for some of the various things that Subspace may want to build, builder grants. And I know this is something that we are thinking about, although it's surely not something that we have announced formally. But Wei, maybe you can talk a little bit, just kind of generally, about some of the things that we may be thinking about for the future. That's a great way. And that kind of leads into another thing that we've seen in the chat several times when it gets into things like use cases. And I guess I would direct that one to you and Nazar. When people talk about just more fundamentally, we've talked a lot about the technical instances of running a farmer and running a node and storing the data and proofs of archival storage. But how about when it comes down to use cases at the DApp level? When we're talking about building applications, what do you see as the ideal use cases for Subspace? Nazar, you want to go first with that one?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting use cases is something like Metaverse, because if you imagine the world where it's all online and you're logging in with your VR headset and you are looking around, there are all these like sounds, textures, shapes. Everything is owned by someone, like everyone has an NFT for it. But if someone shuts down the S3 bucket on AWS because they like stop paying for it and half of the world just disappears, that would be very unfortunate. So for those kinds of use cases where you have some data that you want to store forever, just like in real world, it makes a lot of sense to use storage which has the same guarantees of persistence as your ownership, which means the same guarantees as the blockchain. And since Subspace can store data on the blockchain, that's like a really nice natural fit for that.
Yeah, the proofs of useful storage is Nazar. Hopefully, everybody was here earlier when he talked about that. How we're actually using the data with a proof of useful storage versus useless storage on some other blockchains, where the data that you're storing actually has some real utility. So that's a very important distinction as well. So getting back to the plotting a little bit then, G asks in the chat, is it faster to write the plot with a SSD and after to move it to the hard drive? And Nazar, I know you already talked about that, but maybe you can just repeat again the nuances of trying to move a plot and the word of warning, if you could just repeat that.
Yeah, technically it is faster in some cases, though the size of the network is such that it's just barely over 50 gigabytes. So as long as your plot is not, I don't know, 50 terabytes, there will be no difference. But if it's 50 terabytes, you're unlikely to have 50 terabytes SSD. And even if you do, moving data from that one to hard drive will take time. So in the end, it just doesn't make sense to use that kind of setup, sort of like it was in Chia, where you have SSD where you're plotting and then you're moving it around. In terms of just moving data, yes, you can just move data. Make sure to not copy it and run two farmers because you'll get burned. But you can certainly take your plot, move it from one disk to another, or like one computer to another. Just make sure to only use it on one of the computers at a time.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And another thing that we've seen quite a bit is there's been some talk about opening ports and problems with antivirus potentially and things like that and workarounds. So Justin or Nazar, if one of you could maybe comment on that. I know we had talked about there potentially being some ports that you just need to make sure that are open, potentially any exclusions during the installation or afterward that you may have to set an antivirus. Which one of you would like to maybe talk about that for a moment?
I can take this one. So there is port 30,333 that is used by the node. That port is mentioned in the official documentation. Justin wrote an excellent article in the documentation about how to set it up on different routers. That port is necessary for correct networking communication between different nodes, which will help both your node to sync faster and for other nodes to sync from you. So while it's not like absolutely hardcore requirement, it's very, very strongly recommended to make sure that you have that port forwarding or exception in the firewall if you have it configured such that the network connectivity works properly and you can actually participate fully in the network and not being unreachable, basically, for everyone else.
Justin, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. You're the one who's seeing these questions come in on a day-to-day basis. Is there anything that you would like to say? Maybe some things that you've seen pop up regarding installation as it pertains to antivirus, network ports, or anything along those lines?
I think Nazar covered the majority of it. As he mentioned, just make sure it's definitely going to help. It's not a hardcore requirement. And one other thing I wanted to mention too was if you are going to be transferring your plot, if I'm not mistaken, Nazar, you also have to export the identity from your farmer, correct?
If you move just all of the data, the whole folder, you don't. Okay. There is actually no command for that anymore, so it doesn't exist.
Perfect. Yeah, that was the only other question I had seen outstanding from the community. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time.
Yeah, great. We've got about 5 minutes left. And again, we'd love to hear your questions. So if anyone from the community would like to put anything in the chat, if you'd like to raise your hand, we'll be happy to invite you to the stage. We're just going through some of the more common questions that we've seen. And Nazar, another one that has come up is about the installation process. And in the future, if anything is going to be done to help simplify that, perhaps not using GitHub, or how that process is going to look in the future. Maybe you could add a little color there.
Yeah, so I think the end goal for Subspace would be for most farmers to just use desktop applications. That's where we see the biggest audience would be in terms of number of nodes. There is certainly some challenges for opening ports and such. In terms of not using GitHub, we are actually trying to move away from that a little bit. So if you go to the Docs Subspace network, you'll see the farming guide, and that farming guide has direct links to the binaries you need to download. And it has all of the up-to-date documentation about all of the steps for different platforms. It has a nice article about ports opening. All of that is ideally in there. And in most cases, you don't need to go to GitHub at all. And the nice part is that documentation on GitHub, it has some of the places where you need to substitute some of the parameters. Some of those parameters which are specific to a particular release are actually already substituted with the correct values in the docs subspace network. So it's even easier to start. You just need to specify something like reward address, and you need to specify the amount of space you want to allocate. But most of the other parameters are already in place, so it should be easier for you to start.
Great. Look forward to that. And Teslac has posted a question about will we eventually be able to support multiple farmers per node? I know we've talked about a lot of other things in terms of, running multiple instances of nodes and multiple plots and what's more efficient. Do I run one, 200 gigabyte plot or two 100 gigabyte plots? But this question, maybe you could wrap that into it, Nazar, but this one is specifically about supporting multiple farmers per node, if that's something that will be possible in the future.
Yeah, so in the end, it doesn't really matter if you have 10 farmers of, let's say, 100 gigabytes or one farmer of 1 terabyte. In some sense, it's actually more efficient to have one farmer. The current release doesn't really properly support more than one farmer per node. So I wouldn't recommend that to use, because otherwise your farmer will not plot everything and you'll not get all of the rewards. Your plot will be smaller. And that also goes back to the question, like some people were downloading the database for the blockchain and then were starting. Sure, you're synced fully, but your node is not doing, your farmer is not doing anything. So try to not do that, please. Try to follow official instructions. In the future, we'll probably support that. But in the end, it just boils down to how much space you can allocate. And if you have more than one disk on most operating systems, it's fairly easy to create something like RAID array or just JBOD, which is short for just a bunch of drives. And you can just combine the space that you have that way, and you can specify where farmers should store its data, and you can use that way. Certainly in the future, there will be more options, but this is the state of affairs as of today.
Great. And we have a question from Zornox. It's two parts. Justin, I'm going to throw that first part to you in just a second about where they can go to understand how the system is running as expected. I know that you're very up to speed on where the documentation is and to tell people where to look for that. But the second part of that for you first, Nazar, is what is the purpose of the various folders, plot 0, plot 1, plot 2, and so on? Maybe you can just explain exactly what those folders are, what's in them, and why there are so many.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's like more on the development side. Those are actually subplots I mentioned. So if you have more than 100 gigabytes allocated for the farmer, chances are you will have more than one of those folders. That's basically the only reason. It's like implementation detail. There's really not much to worry about that.
That's perfect. And then, Justin, the first part of that over to you about where can someone go to better understand, to tell that the system is running as expected? Where can they go to read and get more information?
Yeah, so obviously our documentation, docs.subspace.network, we tried to include examples of, successful node operation in those commands, so you can kind of get a feel of what you should see, what you shouldn't see. Nazar and the development team have also done a really good job in trying to just specify and clarify anytime an error does pop up. So generally, you'll see an error in the CLI or in your terminal or in your logs if you're on Subspace desktop regarding, whatever error is occurring. Obviously, it's not going to be 100%. If something seems a little off, you can always hop into our Discord channel or onto our forum post and post a screenshot or post your logs, and we'd be happy to take a look at it. But generally, for the most part, look like any CLI command, just look for any errors, any cancellation of the process where it just kind of exited, things along those lines. And also, obviously, reading our white paper and just some of our existing materials will also give you a good understanding of just how Subspace works broadly, which will probably also help with your troubleshooting during trying to determine if your farmer/node is running properly.
That's great, Justin. Thank you. And I know we are on the hour. We want to be respectful of everyone's time, but there are a couple questions that have just come into the chat. I hope we still have time to answer them, guys. I hope you can still stick around. And we'll try to get through these as quickly as possible. But if anybody has to drop off because of time constraints, we want to thank you so much for coming and remind you that we are here every week. at the same exact time for office hours, and we're here to take your questions. And these last few, if we can try to get through them quickly, Nazar P3 has asked, why can't the node sync without the farmer?
It can, and that's actually the way our archival nodes are working. They are not farming; they are just giving the bandwidth back to the community. So that's totally possible.
Perfect. That's what I thought. And then the next question, I'm going to throw to you. Go ahead. I was going to throw it over to you anyway, Wei, about this next question. But you go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah, because they are coupled, and if you specify dash dash validator, it means that you're intending to run a farmer, so node will wait for the farmer basically forever. But if you remove that, it will just proceed without the farmer.
No, it's a great point, Wei. Thank you for clarifying that. And since we've got you on, the next question from SB123. Will the reward promised for people who participated in the previous stress test coincide with when the rewards are turned on for Gemini? And I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but I'm going to let you go ahead and answer. Awesome, Way. Thank you for clarifying that. And I guess the last question we'll go ahead and take, and Nazar, I'm going to throw this back to you, is somebody with a very large hard drive is asking about the max plot size. They set it to 60 terabytes, and the farmer wasn't able to reach the line, which indicates that the sync is done. So, is there in fact a max plot size? And do you have any information you could help this person with?
There is no hard-coded limit in the protocol to speak of. However, we haven't really tried or like tested that in such a big scale. So if you have that much space, please create a thread on the forum, and you can even tag me directly, and we'll try to understand what is happening, how it's happening, and what we can do about it. I personally don't have that much space to even like try to reproduce it, unfortunately. But it's great that someone is trying to do that, and we are happy to find a solution.
Yeah, totally agree, Zornox. That's great. We're glad to hear people are trying this with such large drives, and we certainly look forward to hearing from you. If you could please let us know how that's going, and we'll be happy to help you. So that's great. Okay, so we're at about 5 minutes after. Again, I want to thank everybody for coming, and thank you to Nazar and to Justin and to Wei for answering all these questions. And again, we're back here at the same hour every week. And we will be back to take your questions again next week. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And we'll see you next week. And again, this is our Justin Away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Todd. See you guys.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.